Well, good morning, and you've joined me at the beautiful Lindholme Lakes for a spot of shallow fishing and margin fishing. At the moment, these are the two most effective methods on commercials, especially at Lindholme at the moment. So today we're going to be fishing shallow with maggots and down the margin with maggots and ground bait as well, and catching literally fish from these little F1s. Look at them, absolutely stunning. Right up to some big carp hopefully down the margins. But let's talk about the shallow fishing first. And as well as that, we're going to talk about everything regarding the rigs that I'm using, the feeding patterns, but also my setup. To me, when I'm a commercial angler, I want to be so organised, and it's so important to have everything critically balanced from your seat position, from your legs, which allows you to keep a tight line against that float. It's going to catch you more fish. All those little elements are really, really important for commercial fishing if you want to gain a big weight, regardless of the terrain that you're faced with. So let's get talking about the rigs first of all. Right, let's talk about rigs. You cannot get anything simple, but it's only simple if you actually understand the logic behind what you're trying to achieve. We're in the summertime now. The fish want to feed in that shallow water. So what you've got to do is you've got to minimise your options, be logical, but keep feeding bait. That is the most important factor. If you stop feeding, the fish have no reason to come up to the surface to intercept the bait because there's no bait there. Keep feeding. Progression produces competition for feeding fish, invites more fish into your feeding zone, so to speak, and in turn you're going to catch a load more fish, and as the day progresses the fish are going to get bigger. So let's talk about the rigs to start off with. Now, we're on bonsai today. Now, I'm a big believer, especially on this lake, which is very similar to a lot of your snake lakes, your smaller commercials. The fish are compacted into a smaller density of water because there's more fish per square metre, if that makes sense, than an open water lake. So therefore, they feed at a very, very shallow depth. And especially on bonsai, I always find a fixed rig is usually always better than what we're going to talk about later on, which is the jigger, which is without doubt one of my favourite ways of catching fish shallow and so effective. So let's talk about the fixed rig setup first of all. I'm using Mark Harris diamond floats. I love these floats because they take minimal weight. So I'm fishing with maggots. Now maggots are a slow falling bait. I suppose let's go back to basics, right? When it comes to, regardless of the terrain that you're faced with, a river, canal, commercial fishery, it all goes down to the basic fact of feed and presentation. The more natural you get your hook bait looking to your feed, the more fish you're going to catch. So this is why on my rigs here, I've got two number 11s as droppers and two number 11s, exactly the same. And that creates a nice progressive slow fall of the bait. Now I'm only fishing, 12 inches deep on that rig and 6 inches deep on that rig, but there's still a fall of bait. And you can imagine if that is the water line where that float is, there's a massive distance where that bait needs to fall in order for the fish to intercept it, because they could be actually feeding at that depth here. So having a slow falling bait is really effective because it allows you to catch fish from slapping your rig on the surface where your rig's straight on the surface, and then it falls down to that depth, right down to where your rig is completely straight and the fish are coming up to your bait and grabbing your hook bait, and that is what sets the hook and catches your fish without actually having to strike. It's such an effective way, and once you get the setup right, it's really, really effective. The key behind that is the length of line that you fish, and it does daunt a lot of people when it comes to this style of fishing. They're worried about getting a tangle. What matters is you use the right float that prevents tangles, and this is the beauty about these floats here. Although they're a bristle float, they very rarely tangle. But also when the rig hits the water, the carbon stem cuts through that water, and that is why I've just got a number 10 shot just underneath the float. Add a bit of weight to that float to help it cut through that surface tension, so the float is working instantly. But I've got two different depths. Like I say, one at 12 inch, one at 6 inch. Progression takes time. It's not going to happen within minutes. It might be 2 hours, it might be 3 hours into the session where all of a sudden you've reached that optimum time where the fish are competing that is where your rig depth changes, and your rig choice of the depth that you're fishing is really important. To start off with, I'm catching at this depth, 12 inches. I've not actually picked this rig up yet because I don't feel there's enough fish feeding in my peg at this present time. I've only been feeding the peg 20 minutes. So I want to fish a little bit deeper, because you can imagine the fish are a little bit less amount of fish in my peg, less reason for them to compete near the surface. So a deeper rig is just as effective. I'm using Aero Slick Silk 019 as a main line. Nice robust line, something that's quite thick that prevents tangles. When you go down to your thinner main lines, that's where you get problems with really light, short lines. Using a thicker line helps the rig keep straighter as well. I'm using a 4-inch hook length of 013 Aero Slick Silk. Exactly the same setup on both of the rigs, and exactly the same weight as I've already explained. Now the interesting thing is I've got a 4-inch hook length on, but I've actually added shot onto my hook length. That last dropper there is on my hook length, and that allows me to critically adjust how tight I want that line. So if I feel that fish are intercepting the bait on the drop, I can just move that shot up and create a 3-inch fall of that bait. Whereas if they're really attacking that bait, I want to keep a straight line. I will move that shot further down near the hook, like so. That keeps the rig even straight, and that comes into play with the bolt rig effect is what I'm talking about. Even with depths of above 12 inches, that is really, really effective. So just because you're using a specific length, hook length, a 4-inch, a 5-inch, whatever, by adding shot onto your hook length really does widen the diversity of that particular length, hook length, without you having to swap hook lengths, if that makes sense. So rather than me getting a 3-inch hook length out, I like to add shot onto my hook length, and for that depth at the time, if I feel it's right, it allows me to critically adjust how my maggots work. Now, these floats are absolutely brilliant, and what I've done is I've dotted the float down almost as if you can't see it. I'm not actually watching the float, if that makes sense. What I'm doing is I'm using the minimal resistance of that float, just biting the water tension, so when a fish sucks in the bait, it naturally pulls the float under, it tightens the line up to the pole tip, and you hook the fish. The fish hooks itself naturally, you do not have to strike. The advantage to that is you're maximising your bite ratio, but it also allows you to watch other people, because you don't have to concentrate on your float 100%. It gives you time to watch what other people are doing around you. So they are the fixed rigs. Hook choice, quite simple, exactly the same hook, SLWG 16 double maggot. And I'm going to show you how to hook the bait on as well, because that's really important if you're catching a lot of fish. So they're the two rigs. They're the two most common rigs that are going to cover me from, let's say, 14 inches right down to 3 or 4 inches. And that's the area you want to be looking at with maggots, because they fall at such a slow rate, the fish are coming higher up in the water to intercept the bait, as opposed to baits such as casters or pellets, where you need to fish that little bit deeper because they fall faster. Right, let's talk about the third rig now. Now, first of all, one thing I've not mentioned is the elastic I'm using. It's Elite Hollow. I absolutely love this elastic. And if you've noticed, I've got a long dangly bit on my bead. Now, I'm a massive believer with this, that I've got my elastic set up so the Dacron connector at the end sits at the end of the pole tip once I've unhooked a fish, so everything is neat and uniformed. But I always like an extra length of elastic. So let's say, for example, I'm using F1 kits today. There's less elastic in F1 kits, and I do this even with my normal length top kits, that if I hook a big carp, I've got that extra elastic in the pole that you can imagine if a carp wants to bottom me out, it will pull the elastic through that bead, so I've got less chance of pulling out of that big carp. Because I'm fishing maggots, I'm not fishing a thick line, I'm only fishing 013. So therefore, I want that extra cushion. If I do hook a big double figure fish that could be a match winning fish, I want to land it. And that extra elastic that could be pulled through to that bead could save that fish and prevent me from getting broke or pulling out of it. Now let's talk about the rig itself, the jigger. Again, the same line, 019 Aero Slick Silk line. Slightly deeper now. I'd say it's about 2.5 foot, the length of the rig. I've got a float stop here at 8 inches because the rule on the fishery is an 8-inch lash. But the jigger is such an effective way of catching fish, simply because it allows you to fish at depths right from where the float hits the shot at 3 inches or 4 inches, dictated by the length of your hook length. On this rig, it's a 4-inch hook length, right up to the top of the stop there. So you're covering a massive depth of water, and this is what I love about the jigger, because it really does help you find at what depth those fish are intercepting your bait. The beauty about it as well, though, more to the point, and this is the reason why it is so effective, is you've always got a tight line to your hook bait, because it's a free running float. So it's down to you as the angler to position yourself comfortably, which dictates at what depth your hook bait is, because if you hold your pole low, then you're going to go into that deeper water. So it's really important, especially in the summertime, that you hold your pole a specific way to ensure you're at a set depth every single time, because it's purely down to how you hold the pole as an angler which dictates what depth you're sat at. That is so important. Exactly the same setup. I've got 3 number 8s as bulk down there, and then exactly the same hook again, 013 hook length to a 16 SLWG. So that is the rig choice. 3 rigs, nice and simple, but extremely effective. So what I've decided to do is fish at a comfortable distance where I can still feed my bait accurately. And with maggots, that's really important. You need to find the optimum balance. You don't want to feed them too far out, because otherwise they start spraying everywhere and you lose that accuracy, that focal point, what you're trying to achieve with your bait. And you don't want to feed them too near, because it takes longer for your shallow line to work, especially in match conditions when there's bankside pressure with anglers around you. So fish at a comfortable distance that allows you to achieve that tight feed, or a reasonably tight feeding pattern. Now, of course, with maggots, you're always going to get a larger spread than you will with baits such as casters. And you've got to be positive, you've got to keep feeding. Because you can imagine, everything feeds on maggots. And then hopefully, over the progression of time, you'll then start getting an arrival of fish from that size right up to your bigger carp as well. But I'm trying to keep everything nice and tight, especially with fishing a short lash, a nice little light rig. I want to minimise tangles. So I'm keeping everything nice and tight all the time. And the key thing is, after you've landed a fish, which I'll go through next time, is not having too much pressure on your rig that could cause the hook to pull out of the fish's mouth and in turn a tangle. The more time I'm in the water, the more fish I'm going to catch, especially with shallow fishing, because once you get your peg going, you'll catch very consistently with this approach. And I can see that's the first time I've seen a fish boil for the bait. Now, I'm fishing 12 inches deep, and this is the beauty about these fine adjustments. I'm not going to stick at 12 inches for very long, because I know now the fish are starting to come higher up in the water, even shallower than 12 inches, to intercept that bait. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make a slight adjustment with this rig and move it down to 10 inches. You can see by how the rig's working that I'm at the wrong depth. It's definitely not right, that. So let's just make this quick change, and then I'll be able to show you the difference. So all I'm going to do, I'm going to get that shot, move it down 2 inches. So now I'm 10 inches deep instead of 12. So let's have a look at the difference. I'm convinced that the fish are just a little bit shallower than the depth I'm fishing. Now I've got my peg going. So let's see how long it takes for me to hook a fish now. Now, this is why you've got to feed a larger volume of maggots, because you can see as I'm feeding this bait, it's creating quite a large spread. And also I've got a wind that's coming through that gap causing a bit of problem with my feeding. So you've always got to compensate for, I'd say, 20 to 30% of your bait not going in the area where you want it to go. And you have to keep going through the motions. It's not something you can just pick up and do for 20 minutes and then put it down. You have to keep going with it. And if you progress with it, keep working at it, it'll get stronger. What is a good point though with shallow fishing is, at the start of the match, never go on it. Always give it that extra time to get working properly and efficiently. And if the pole tip isn't over the fish's head, they'll feed far more confidently quicker in shallower depths than you sat there with your pole rig in the water. So give the fish time to feed confidently in the bait. And that's what I mean, they're coming into the centre of the bait. So what I'm doing is I'm slapping a couple of times. Doesn't really matter with maggots as much, but I've got my box positioned in such a height that I'm naturally holding the pole with a tight line against the float. I don't have to do anything because this is the beauty about the Octbox. It allows me to critically adjust the height of the box to tailor my knees, my position that I want. When I'm shallow fishing, I'm naturally feeling comfortable now fishing a tight line. I'm not having to reposition my legs or anything like that. And that is so important for commercial fishing. Now the interesting thing is I've shallowed up to 10 inches. I'm not getting as many indications. And this is why depth when you're fishing for F1s and carp, but especially F1s, is so important. And so a lot of people might think, well, they're deeper. Well, actually, they could be even shallower than 10 inch. But I'm not going to go shallow too early. Yeah, they've got one now, but yeah, they just need a bit more time for the peg to get going. There's a lot of small stockies in here now, but they all add up. Hello, mate. You're going to be a big F1 in a few years, aren't you? But try and keep everything smooth. And also, if you feel that the peg's not quite what it should be, just take your time. Rather than shipping straight out, feed your peg first. Group the fish without the pole tip over the heads. And then what happens is, usually, when they're a little bit moody, like what they are at the moment, oh, Mr. Duck, out of the way. Come on. Slap the rig. And you usually get a response quite far quicker if you start feeding in between your pole being over the top. So that could be when you've hooked a fish, feed straight after, or when you've landed a fish before you ship out, feed. Now I can see straight away, and this is the beauty about rig choice, having an array of rigs. You can't just get away shallow fishing on these kind of venues with one rig. You have to have at least 2 or 3, because you need to search and find the correct depth, and this isn't the right depth at the moment. So let's just go back, move it back up 2 inches. It's not about massive changes, it's those slight subtle changes that make a big difference. They're just not competing in that shallow water yet. Like I said, they could be even shallower, but I don't want to go into that really shallow water until I know it's right. So I'm just holding a tight line against that float and feeding on a regular basis to the point where it's very rare my catapult isn't in my hand. I've got the catapult in my hand all the time. And that's forcing me to feed bait. As soon as you put that catapult down, your feed ratio goes down. And the process, what you're trying to achieve, which is get more fish into your peg, is slowed down as a result. I mean, they're not big fish. What did I say about a tangle, Tom? They're not big fish, but they all add up. You know, fish on a regular basis like that. Hopefully this will come out very quickly, like that. And as bizarre as it sounds, when you have got a shallow rig on, because there's not a lot of line to play with, if you do get a little wrap round, they do untangle very quickly. So again, let's just give it another feed before we go back out. And you just have to be uniformed as regards to consistent with your feeding. Don't stop feeding. It's not about ploughing a lot of bait in, it's just about feeding on a regular basis. Getting those fish competing, and this is equally effective, this way of fishing, for fish like ide and roach, shallow with maggots. Especially on your commercial scene. I'm just holding tight against that float, and then if I want to work the rig, I'll just lift it and drop, and then occasionally lift the whole rig out of the water again to repeat that falling process of my bait falling through the 12 inches. You can imagine all these fish in this peg. That's why you got to just keep going and put fish in the net. If you're getting small fish, it doesn't matter. Just keep going. Put them in the net. Everything counts. Just look at that straight away. As soon as I've changed depth now, you can tell, like I said before, because maggots are such a slow sinking bait, and we're pleasure fishing. We're on our own. We haven't got match conditions. They really are coming up, competing for those maggots now. And I tell you what, this is one of the most enjoyable ways of fishing on commercials because it's so simple. Let's break it down. You go into your tackle shop, you buy yourself 4 or 5 pints of maggots. You could even take some hemp. You could even feed hemp with your maggots. A couple of rigs, hook some maggots on, feed some bait, and fish a rig in the middle of it, and you catch everything that swims. It's as simple as that. You can be fishing within 5 minutes as soon as you put your box down. And it all makes sense. Middle of summer, fish want to be in that shallow water. It all makes sense. But you could see the difference as soon as I've gone to this shallower rig, that now I'm hooking fish more positively, because now the fish, it's almost as if the best way of looking at it is my hook bait is above the depth where the fish are feeding, so they're actually having to come up to grab the bait, and then as they go back down, that's what sets the hook. Now, if I'm getting less indications on this, that is, to me, is a good thing. I don't want my rig moving left to right. I just want my pole going down, which shows that the fish are coming up for the bait. As soon as I get, like, where all of a sudden it slows down a bit, I'll just swap to my other rig. And we're also going to give the jigger a go, because I think that might work today with it being a bit cooler. Just now and again, just lift the rig to work that hook bait up from the surface back down to the depth. And you can see, although I've had 2 in 2 bungs, it's a little bit slower regarding indications, but that's a good thing, that. Keep feeding the peg. I'm not feeding a massive amount of maggots each time, because I've only brought with me 4 pints. And if you feed it right, 4 pints will last you quite a long time. Just take your time, enjoy the process. That's what it's all about. Enjoy the process. Be nice and smooth. And eventually, you'll end up catching... Oh yeah, that was a bit lucky. My hook's come out. Hook's pulled out. You'll end up catching, big chunky F1s. Like this. Look at that. Ooh, it's got a bit of sores on it because we've just finished spawning. Look at him. Lively though. Look at that. That's what it's all about. Let's slip him in the net. Right, I'll tell you what I'm going to do now. I'm going to swap to a jigger because I am catching a mixture of small F1s up to decent F1s now. Look at that. Lovely. But I also want to find the optimum depth. And I do not want to do that. Imagine if I did that in a match. I want to find the optimum depth. And this is the beauty about the jigger. Because it allows you to search the column. Now, bonsai is notorious. We've talked about the bait, the principle, what we're trying to achieve. I might end up having to shorten this jigger up. But like I said, it's such a great, effective way of catching fish because you've always got a tight line with it as long as you don't hit the float stop at the bottom, at the top, so to speak, at the top of the rig. And as well as that, with a jigger, you make more noise on the surface because it's a heavier float. So we go out to the top, slap on the surface, 3 slaps, and immediately I'm holding the pole tip up. So now, if I lift up, my rig comes out of the water, which tells me I'm 4 inches deep, because that is the length of the hook length. Well, 5 inches including the float and a bit of shot. So immediately after slapping, I'm holding that float up to the depth where I think the fish are at. Feed some bait. Hopefully get a pull down or a bite where the tip goes down now. And if it doesn't, what I'm then going to do is I'm just going to lower my pole tip just a bit. So now I'm about 10 inches deep. And this is the beauty about the jigger. As long as you've got the right length of line between your pole tip and the hook bait, you can very accurately read at what depth my hook bait is at. So if I lift my pole up 6 inches, I come out. So I'm literally about 10 inches deep there. Now, like I said, a jigger is so effective on many waters. On this particular lake, it doesn't seem to be as effective as a fixed rig, but you've always got to set it up because, like I said before, it allows me to search the column. And for all we know, and it happens many a time when you're shallow fishing, that the bigger fish are actually feeding below where the small fish are feeding. So I'm just holding it down now about 2 foot, just out of curiosity. But one thing I've always noticed on this lake, you have to be at a specific set depth. And the jigger just doesn't give you that consistency with depth is the best word. So that's my first fish on the jigger, but it's no bigger. And like I said, this is a problem with the jigger. On this particular lake, you need to be at a specific depth, like literally inches deep. And unfortunately, the jigger's just not allowing me to be accurate enough on a consistent basis. On other lakes, where it's a little bit deeper, a bit more open, expansive water, the jigger is unbeatable. Literally, when I go on Benny's or other lakes such as Benny's, it's the only rig I rely upon because it just allows me to cover such a different multitude of depths within seconds. It helps me read at what depth the fish are feeding so much quicker than a fixed rig. So there we go. We've got 3 different approaches. We've got the really shallow, we've got the 12 inches work, and we've got the jigger that allows you to cover a multitude of depths in seconds, and literally 3 rigs that will cover you for all your commercial fishing regardless of where you go, and the species that you target as well, especially when you're looking at F1s, silvers, eyed. So I hope that information is going to help you catch a whole load more fish. But of course, like I said to you at the beginning, keep it simple. Keep that bait going in. It all comes down to that simple fact, feed and presentation. As long as you keep that feed going in, you're going to get fish competing, coming up in that water, and you're going to end up with a great net of fish, regardless of whether you're in a match or pleasure fishing. So hopefully, until next time, tight lines.